My name is Manuel Roman Lacayo. I am the acting director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome for our 8th Charlemos event in our series. We are fortunate to have Scott Morgenstern moderating a discussion with Jennifer McCoy and Stefano Palestini on international organizations and democracy promotion in Latin America. So without further ado, Scott.
Great. Thank you very much, Manuel, and thanks to Klaas, as always, for hosting. We've been running Charlemos since the beginning of the pandemic and realized after our last session that we haven't really been doing a good job of advertising or telling people who we are, what we're doing. There are 6 of us who are organizing Charlemos from across 4 continents, 5 countries, includes Jennifer Sear, Raul Sanchez Uribari, Javier Corrales, Fabrizio Lehuc, Andres Mejia, and myself. And our idea, as many of you have seen, is to interview several authors each session about current research that touches important and current political themes. And you should please contact us if you have ideas for future sessions. As you may know, we've been very fortunate to have LAPIS, that's the Latin American Political Institutions section of LASA as a sponsor, and Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh has been our host and very helpful to us. We also want to thank Patty Sotomayor, who's a grad student at the Pontificia Universidad Católica in Chile, who's our capable and very helpful assistant. With that, let me quickly introduce our panelists and we'll get on to the charla. First, we have Stefano Palestini, who's a professor also at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, who specializes on the topic that we're talking about today, regionalism and democracy, building, especially in times of crisis. He's been a visiting professor in Europe and the United States and has a new and very interesting paper about sanctions that we'll be discussing today that's titled Regional Organizations and Politics of Sanctions Against Undemocratic Behavior in the Americas. It was published this year in International Political Science Review. Secondly, we have Jennifer McCoy, who for most of you will not need any introduction. But just to remind you, she's a distinguished professor at the Georgia State University. And for almost 20 years, she served as the director of the Americas program for the Carter Center. She's one of the best known voices in discussions of democracy building, having written about it extensively and worked in the role as an election observer and mediator for the Carter Center. As such, she is no stranger to the complications and controversies regarding democratic building or democracy building. An example, she was the author of a report about the disputed Venezuelan election in 2004, wrote an interesting book about international mediation in Venezuela after that. She also has an extensive publication record, having been the editor of 2 recent special journal volumes about polarization and democracy. Today's charla is going to revolve around a paper she wrote with her co-author, Thomas Legler, a few years ago that's titled Games People Play, International Regime and Domestic Actor Complexity in Venezuela's Political Crises. That is, of course, plural crises. I'm going to try to keep us relatively close to the papers themselves as we go through this, but we will wander a little bit into general themes on democracy building. That'll allow us to talk about the United States, regional organizations, and their role in democracy building in Venezuela and elsewhere. At the end, I hope to circle back to have their comments a little bit about the United States from a perspective of democracy building and as election observers. To begin, I'd like to ask Jennifer if she could give us an update on the Venezuelan talks. There's been a lot of international efforts to mediate a resolution to the crisis there. There were talks last year, there were talks over the summer that broke down, I believe, with Norway mediating them. Colombia, I understand lately, has asked the United States to get back involved, but at least during the Trump administration, that probably wasn't very viable. So I wonder if you could just start by giving us a little bit of an update on what's going on there.
Well, I think the last international effort was the EU visit in September, trying to see if they could negotiate conditions for the parliamentary, that is the National Assembly elections, which are scheduled now for December 6th. And to see if they could negotiate conditions for those to be both acceptable to the opposition to participate in and for the EU to observe, but that was not successful. So those elections will be going on with a boycott by the opposition. The opposition has meanwhile scheduled a consultative referendum themselves on two questions, but about whether or not they would accept these elections and how to move forward. So December 6th, there will be parliamentary elections, and they will be contested or challenged, not considered legitimate by a large number of people, both internationally and nationally, but the regime is trying to get legitimacy for that. And then there will be this process over a week-long period from December 5th to the 12th of the opposition carrying out this kind of parallel consultation of people. And I think that there's, as far as I know, there are no other talks going on at the moment. I think everyone's just waiting for this to happen and for a new administration to come into the US.
I was going to ask you that if you'd want to speculate a bit about the how the transition, or I guess it's still purported transition in the United States, is going to affect this process.
Yeah, I think that Biden and his team, his advisors on Latin America have made pretty clear that they will definitely be strongly supporting democracy and human rights in Venezuela specifically and in the region, but also will want to follow a multilateral approach, will not be doing a unilateral approach. I think they will be much less strident in terms of, and will not be saying things like everything is on the table, implying there could be a military invasion, which we can talk about. I think that's been, very destabilizing for the country. But I think that, well, I hope what they will do, and I think what they will do is consider the sanctions as more of a tool for leverage that they could be used in a flexible way to flexibilize the sanctions to encourage a negotiated transition, and be more willing to do that than we've seen so far under the Trump administration.
Stefano, can I turn to you now a little bit and also get you to focus a little bit on Venezuela, but you're generally, I think I'd like to hear about sort of from the perspective of your paper, which talks about complexity, institutional complexity, and the role of regional organizations, and talk about the Venezuelan crisis a little bit.
Sure, thank you, Scott. Well, the thing is that, when we talk about democracy protection, we should actually talk, as Jennifer and Tom do, about a regime, a complex regime in which you have different organizations. So on the one hand, you have the OES as the continental organization, and then you have the sub-regional organizations, CARICOM, Mercosur, UNASUR, etc. And they are quite different. For instance, if we talk about the US, the relationship of the US with these organizations is completely different. In the OES, the US is a member, is part of the decision-making process, is also the main contributor to the budget of the OES, whereas in the sub-regional organizations, the US is rather a shadow, in the sense that it's not part of the membership, but of course, when Mercosur or the old UNASUR took a decision, an important political decision, of course, they were looking at what the US would do, how the US was going to react, etc. In the case of Venezuela, let me just talk about the OES, and maybe we can say something about the other organizations. I think because the crisis has been quite long, we have to distinguish between different stages. So I would say there is a first moment between roughly 2014 until 2017, in which basically the OES didn't play any role at all. And this is because two reasons. The first one is basically because there was no possibility for a coalition that supported the enforcement of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I know that in Washington, many people blame the Chilean Jose Miguel Insulza, who was the Secretary General at that time, for not doing anything. But I think this is pretty unfair, because if you look at the governments at that time, it was practically impossible to forge such a pro-enforcement coalition. And also because Maduro was quite smart and forum shopped different organizations. So preferred UNASUR as a mediator than the OAS. Then this changed completely between 2017 and 2018 because there was a change of government in Argentina with Macri, in Brazil with Temer, in the US with Trump, and also you have Peña Nieto desperately looking for an area of consultation with the Trump administration. And I think he saw the Venezuelan crisis as an opportunity to kind of getting close to the US. And with those countries was easier for the OAS to actually enforce the Inter-American Democratic Charter. They couldn't, though, apply sanctions because of the quorum, the 2/3 quorum of the OAS, and because Maduro had allies that actually acted as veto points for these type of decisions. And then finally, you have the last period that goes from 2018 until now, in which I would say that the OAS doesn't play any role at all, because actually the own actors that are part of the OAS have been bypassing the OAS itself. You see, for instance, Secretary Almagro helping to construe this case for the International Criminal Court, or trying to activate unilateral sanctions through the TR, or actually members of the OAS creating this parallel group, that is the Grupo de Lima, that are all valid strategies, but that at the end of the day, they have sort of undermined their own OAS. And I think right now it's very hard to see a place for the OAS in the Venezuelan crisis.
Let me follow up with that on one question that also comes right out of your paper, that you say the OAS or other regional organizations have a almost an anti-incumbent bias, I think is how you put it, that it's very difficult to deal with a crisis when it's the incumbent himself, him or herself, that's causing the threat to democracy. Could you expand on that a bit?
Sure. I think my paper basically provides new evidence supporting a claim that other scholars, other colleagues have made before. Also, Jennifer, I think, has argued something similar. That is basically the idea that we shouldn't forget that at the end of the day, are the governments the receivers or the targets of democracy clauses, but they are also the enforcers of the same democracy clauses. So it's pretty tricky. So of course, governments or executives, the executive branch of the governments, they don't want to go against a fellow head of government. Of course, they will be very fast and very quick in activating democracy clauses when there is a coup d'etat, for instance, against an executive, but not when the executive itself is the one undermining democratic institutions, as is the case, or is pretty often the case in the current years. I think it's very good to make the contrast also with the human rights protection regime, because in the human rights you have a relatively autonomous enforcement authority. In the case of the Americas, it's the Commission, the court, but you don't have anything similar in the case of the democracy protection regime. So actually both areas develop quite differently in practice.
Thank you. And Jennifer, I mean, your paper with Tom Legler also is focused on regional organizations and the interaction between them and domestic actors. Although when you were writing, UNASUR was much more important than it obviously is today. And so therefore there's more unity amongst the other international actors than at that time, which was one of the limitations you said about their ability to influence rules. So I wonder if you could speculate or talk about that. You know, how is the OAS, from your point of view, how does that change the game that you discuss in your paper?
Yeah, what we were talking about is, you know, kind of a two-level game, but this the main game of international governance being between international organizations or regional organizations and a government. In this case, the government of Venezuela. But how that ability to mediate a democracy crisis changed with domestic conditions, how unified the actors were. So this would be the subgame within the country, and then also how unified the hemisphere was. So comparing 2002 to 2004, when we did the extensive mediation with the Carter Center, the OAS, and the UN, there was great international consensus on democracy promotion principles and ideals. And it was much easier to then we formed that tripartite, much more unified approach with the OAS, UN, and Carter Center. We also had within the country, Chavez, so you had a really clear interlocutor on the government side. And then within the opposition, even though it was still a diverse opposition, at least you had a body, the coordinadora, who did provide someone to negotiate with. And that really changed. So that whole hemispheric consensus changed dramatically from the early 2000s to the next episodes in 2013, 14 on to the future. But they first changed, as Stefano has written about, with this complexity growing and with these competing organizations, especially CELAC and UNASUR, explicitly to keep out the US and Canada, competing. And so that provided alternatives so that, as we talked about, the actors could go forum shopping and decide who they wanted to be, the mediators. But today, and Tom Legler has actually written another recent paper in the European Review on Latin America, talking about what he calls an upheaval, regional order upheaval. So of course, UNASUR has collapsed, CELAC is basically gone, and the OAS is really still ineffective. And I think, so the main thing that happened there was that the hemisphere itself became polarized, in large part because of Venezuela, but became polarized over the question of democracy and what to do about it. Mm-hmm. And even though that is changing today with this new set of conservative presidents that have been elected that Stefano referred to, I don't think that's going to help still the OAS become an effective actor, because we've still got now another level to look at. And this is another super meta game when you do my analysis. And that is, we now have a geopolitical game. This is an international geopolitical game, because we have got, particularly with regards to Venezuela, Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey involved. And so it is no longer just a regional game, and negotiations at the regional level are not going to resolve it, because Venezuela looks to these outside actors outside the region as their safety valve, their, black knights to come and save them. And it's not so that, and the opposition as well goes outside and goes to Europe as well to look for allies. So each side still searches for their allies outside, but it's not just regional. So we have to go beyond the regional organizations to look for some kind of an international cooperative effort to solve it.
Does that discussion change at all when we think about Nicaragua, for example?
Yeah, and Nicaragua, I would say, when you think about the current kind of destabilized situations, and you had mentioned Peru as well, I would put, Nicaragua and Venezuela very similar. You've got the incumbent there who is the clear democracy violator, and in both cases, basically are authoritarian regimes today. And so you have the same set, not as much international involvement from Russia, China, et cetera, in Nicaragua, but the same sets of incentives, disincentives to consider. How do you remove a regime that no longer cares about international legitimacy? And then you've got a very different kind of situation with Peru, which is much more, people disenchanted with the whole political establishment. It's Congress getting in the act here. So I would liken that much more to Ecuador, the destabilization we saw in Ecuador during the 2000s. And so any kind of international effort there, I think, could be useful, but much more facilitating dialogue, trying to be a constructive thing, and not, I don't see any form of sanctions probably happening in a case like that.
Well, you mentioned sanctions, which was the next point on my list of questions here, and I'll ask it in a way for both of you to respond, but I'll let you start, Stefano, since you're focused on sanctions. The question is sort of what tools or what can the international community, regional organizations or otherwise do? Your papers about sanctions in particular. I think, Jennifer, your paper with Tom talks about soft interventions and dialogue or encouraging that. So I wonder if you could talk about it sort of as the nuts and bolts, and what kind of pressures can countries bring to bear on these bad actors?
Right. So I think I like to see international organizations as having a sort of repertoire of instruments to intervene in the case of crisis. Of course, this depends on which regional organization or international organization we are focusing on. But in general, there is a repertoire that goes from those instruments that Jennifer and Tom call soft intervention instruments that are mostly based on mechanisms such as persuasion. And then you have at the other extreme, those instruments that get closer to shaming and even coercion, in which probably we would put sanctions. And the thing is that, well, in my case, I focused on sanctions for two reasons. One, because my paper was part of a special issue on sanctions. That is like the easy answer to your question. But of course, because we saw in sanctions a sort of vantage point to actually observe normative struggles among member states in our international organizations. Struggles about, for instance, what's the meaning of democracy? What is a violation of democracy? Do we really care about democracy? Or do we care more about other types of values, such as political stability, international security, economic interests, that are all very valid? So all these issues, states have to resolve when they face a political crisis, a democratic crisis, and when they are part of a club of states that consider themselves as a democratic club of states, as happens with all these organizations that have democracy clauses. So if you ask me about the relationship, between these sanctions, these more punitive measures, and the softer mechanisms, I think, most of the literature about international sanctions say that basically sanctions don't work. What does it mean? Basically, sanctions don't manage to change the behavior in the desired way of senders, that senders want to change the behavior of the target. That being said, in the case of the Americas, I think sanctions and suspensions have been kind of useful crisis management mechanisms, especially to bring some sort of, I would say, electoral normality in the countries. Of course, this falls short of some democracy deepening on some sort of more ambitious objective. But at least, let's think, for instance, in Honduras in 2009, the suspension of the OAS, I think, helped to bring about some sort of normality in the electoral process. That is quite a basic dimension of democracy. But I also think that sanctions, in order to be effective, they have to be hand in hand. They have to go together with other mechanisms, such as mediation, for instance. I really like what Jennifer said at the beginning, to think of sanctions as sort of flexible mechanisms. I think this is basic, and I think states and organizations are learning about these type of things because they have made a lot of mistakes before.
Jennifer, you want to elaborate on that, on sanctions versus dialogue?
Yeah, because we're thinking about, I did another paper a while ago too, kind of 4 different, what are collective responses to democratic crises? And I kind of put them in 4 categories, if I can remember correctly. Good offices, which is basically dialogue mediation efforts. Diplomatic responses, which can include the naming and shaming that Stefano talks about. And then organizational responses that could include suspension or economic consequences, and then military. So when I think when I think of sanctions, because the discussion is really focused on the US sanctions against Venezuela, it's economic and financial sanctions as opposed to suspension from an organization or diplomatic name and shame, kind of the broader concept that Stefano analyzes in his paper. And so if we think about, very specifically the economic and financial sanctions that are going to hurt either individuals if it's targeted toward individual officials, or is going to hurt a country because it's going to affect the entire country, then, I think we have we have to look at those consequences. Not to know to what extent and I think in most of your cases, they were not applied, Stefano. I think it was more suspension in your cases, or the naming and shaming kinds of things. But that's what we're looking at in Venezuela. And that's where I think that now, more and more research coming out about this, the cost of these sanctions on the people of Venezuela is extremely severe. That's why I do think that we've got to look at a way to, first of all, sanctions have to make clear, what do you want from them? What is the purpose? What is the change in behavior you're asking for by implementing these sanctions? Not just a generic, we're punishing you. They must be, to be effective, targeted toward a change in behavior. And that was not made clear by the US in the beginning of these sanctions. It was begun to be made more clear these last few months, this past year under the Trump administration. And then, of course, is the idea of, are they universal sanctions? And of course, they haven't been for Venezuela, but they've still been extremely painful. So I think that this is what, if the Biden administration can come in and use sanctions, the flexibilization of the sanctions in exchange for a liberalization and a re-democratization of the regime. What I think the best approach would be is to negotiate a transitional government, not immediately presidential elections. I've never been in favor of that approach, even though that's been the main calling card of the opposition, for several reasons. One is because it won't solve the humanitarian crisis, which I think has to be solved first and most urgently, and because we have to have some institutional reform and strengthening. So before you can even have a legitimate presidential election. So what I would hope is that the Biden administration, working multilaterally with Europe, with other Latin Americans, and to try to pull in China and potentially Russia, that'll be more difficult, but potentially Turkey and Iran, to try to give incentives to move toward a joint transitional government that would be a power sharing government, in order to stabilize the economy and social situation and begin to reform the institutions for probably a couple of years and then move forward.
That's really helpful.
May I add something?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, just listening to Jennifer, I was thinking of a paper that actually it's working process. It's a working process that is about the legitimacy of sanctions, because there is a lot of literature that focuses on the effectivity of sanctions, but there is not much about how sanctions are actually perceived by different audiences. So basically in this paper, where we interviewed several decision makers from Latin America, from countries that you would say are closer to Venezuela and countries that are part of the Grupo de Lima. And it's very interesting to see that actually there are some patterns that they don't depend on the political ideology of the decision makers. So for instance, some senders are perceived as more legitimate than others. So it's not a surprise that, for instance, unilateral sanctions, such as the ones that the US is implementing, are considered across the board quite illegitimate. Whereas, for instance, regional sanctions, those that are implemented by regional organizations, are considered the most legitimate ones, even more legitimate than the ones that have been implemented by the European Union, that is considered like a sort of normative actor, part of the international liberal order. However, the fact that the European Union is being as an external sender in somehow undermines its legitimacy claim. So I think this is pretty interesting and kind of shows this type of struggles, in this aspect of international politics.
So this is the aspect of where polarization comes into the, which sort of comes out of the paper that you wrote about. When you have unity amongst the international actors, it's a lot easier to apply sanctions. Very difficult at this time. One of the Q&A, somebody from the question and answer is asking about Peru specifically, that Jennifer, you started to talk about for a moment. And Stefano, one of the things that you say in your paper is about, I think you used the term firefighting or something, where where the regional organizations show up kind of too late, right? The house is already burned down. Is there a role for regional players while there's instability at this point?
Yeah, I think when you look at Peru, or when you look at more generally to sort of authoritarian backsliding in the region, I think the first thing you have to ask is which are the causes of these processes. And of course, we can have different lists of factors, but I would say there are like three main factors that are kind of present in all these type of crises. The first one has to do with a crisis of representation. Let's look at Peru, let's look at Chile and my own country. And this has to do, of course, with the party system, with the design of the political system, and so forth. Then you have what I call a crisis of deliberation. We tend to forget that deliberation is a very important part of a democracy. So the capacity of citizens to discuss, to kind of contrapose different ideas. And this has been undermined by how the mass communication media industry has been structured in our country, also by social media, etc. And finally, you have another very important factor of authoritarian backsliding that has to do with inability, what I call the output crisis. So the inability of states to actually deliver public goods. And all this together is really a cocktail for the emergence of authoritarian populist leaders. So when you think in these terms, the problem is that international organizations such as the OAS, they don't have competencies in any of these particular fields. They simply don't have, So for this reason, they're very badly equipped to kind of act as preventers of the crisis that we are seeing. What they can do, or they are doomed to do, is to be sort of firefighters. And then the discussion that you can have is whether the international organizations can act maybe at earlier stages of the crisis and not when the coup d'etat was already executed or when you have already a populist leader eroding democratic institutions. And then, of course, the Carton Center and Jennifer have done a lot of work there, and also not only scholarly work, but also policy work. And they have suggested and they have made proposals of including this type of institutions, early alarm systems at the OAS. But the problem is that the governments have constantly rejected these proposals. And I think the reason is, again, what we talked at the beginning. The governments don't want more oversight over themselves. I mean, an early alarm system would imply to have a sort of organization such as the Commission or the General Secretariat scrutinizing what governments are doing. And this, of course, is not in the preferences of the incumbents. So basically, summing up, in order to have OAS that can act in this crisis, we would need a new OAS, and we would need a different institutional design.
Yeah, I just want to add, I completely agree with what you said, Stefano. But there is an opportunity, and if we go back in time, if you remember, I think it was around 2004, 2005, Enrique Bolaños in Nicaragua was being challenged as president by the Congress, dominated by the Sandinistas. And he was under threat from his Congress. So let's say similar to the situation in Peru. I mean, a different context, but, with Vizcarra being threatened and eventually overthrown by his own Congress. So Bolaños, this was the only time that I'm aware of, actually went to the OAS, invoked the Democratic Charter, and asked for help. And the OAS did send a mediator, Argentine former foreign minister at the time, Dante Caputo, and worked on mediating that, and eventually did, Bolaños stayed in, and then they had the election and made the transfer of power to Ortega. So there is that possibility that a leader can ask for help from the OAS. I do think that the OAS is much weaker today, and for all the reasons that you mentioned too, Stefano. So, but there is that possibility. But I think also when we think about these kind of things, so we have basically an interbranch conflict, and we've seen this, as I said before, in Ecuador multiple times in the 2000s. Bolivia with the ouster of Goni Sanchez 2 decades ago, more recently in Brazil. When you had this interbranch conflict, but when clearly in this case, Congress didn't want to be investigated for corruption, and so was going to get rid of the corruption, the guy who was going to impose reforms. The only thing that I can think of really for the international, besides sending in a mediator at the request of the threatened incumbent in that case, is going back to the machinery of the in this case, the corruption, what do you call it? What's the peer review? I can't remember the exact name of it within the OAS, but there is a corruption peer review mechanism to try to hold countries to account for their commitments on anti-corruption. And that's the kind of thing that if we had been working on this, so with all of the Odebrecht scandals in the last few years affecting all of Latin America, I mean, ideally, this would have, the OAS could have played a much stronger role in this area and more of a preventive role, as you said, instead of then coming up with these kinds of crises.
Take another question from our floor. This is from Jonathan Hartland, who asks, I'm just going to read it. What incentives can a new U.S. administration provide to Cuba or to China to become involved in assisting a negotiated transition of some kind in Venezuela?
I think for Cuba, the main thing, Cuba has been extremely dependent on Venezuelan oil. And so to influence Cuba, you've got to think about their vulnerabilities and what they need, what they're getting out of their relationship with Venezuela, and try to, address those needs. And for China, similarly, I think China's very different than Russia and than Cuba in terms of its approach to Venezuela and the whole region, in that it is much more purely commercial and resource driven and much more transactional in that sense. And so looking at, for China, I would think, first of all, we have to deal with the larger US-China relationship, and can we have any cooperation? Or is there some other actor that can approach China, whether it be Brazil or some other actors with closer ties to China, and then focusing on the stability that they want and, debt repayment that they want, and focusing on how to meet convincing them that an orderly transition is going to be in their interest, and then, would they assist in such an orderly transition in Venezuela? I would think that those would be the ways to address both of those. But Jonathan, you might have some good ideas too.
Of course.
Right. I haven't done research myself on this, so I can just speculate. But as Jennifer said, I think whatever exists for this crisis in Venezuela, and actually for Maduro to get out of Venezuela and give place to a sort of transition of any kind, I think Cuba has to be part of that story, and probably China as well. And as Jennifer has just said, I don't see China really having a great interest on having Maduro in Venezuela. I mean, China has economic interests that Maduro is not being able, or is hardly being able to basically serve those debts and those commitments. So I think China could be actually an ally for an exit in the case of the Venezuelan crisis. The real question is where the Biden administration is going to create the trust, the linkages to make this possible. I'm not sure. It will depend which people they will put in hemispheric affairs, in the State Department. What's going to be the role of all these actors that actually are outsiders of the executive foreign policy of the U.S. I'm thinking of senators. I'm thinking of Senator Rubio. People that have had a very strong saying in foreign policy towards Venezuela, towards Cuba, of course. And I'm not sure that they will go home with a Biden administration. They will continue having and wielding some sort of influence. So I really don't know if this will happen.
Jen Sear has written to me asking to elaborate about one other actor that hasn't come up yet, is Brazil and Bolsonaro. They were much more involved in international affairs, and now maybe less so on these kind of things. How does that play into this calculation?
Well, I think it's true. We have I mean, we really had vacuums. We've had such vacuums of leadership, in the hemisphere and in the world, first with the US withdrawing, and within the region, Brazil and Mexico as well, withdrawing from regional diplomacy, regional contacts. And that really hurts. I mean, it just feels now so fragile and so such a lack of even a kind of a sense of a region to me. And I think that until countries that have been going through, so many countries going through their own crises, that it's really hard for them to focus and to get back to, a rebuilding of a regional capacity and consensus, kind of ideational consensus. I think it's going to take a long time, and certainly not while we're in the middle of huge corruption scandals, economic crises, and pandemic, as well as countries like Brazil with such a hardline populist government. So I'm not very optimistic in terms of looking at this, in kind of regional organizational or machinery capacity and cooperation in the short term. So hopefully Stefano maybe is more optimistic.
Not at all. I would like to disagree with you, Jennifer, but I cannot. I mean, I was thinking of Mercosur. We haven't talked at all about Mercosur. I mean, Mercosur is also in a pretty badly situation right now, when you have an Argentinian government and a Brazilian government that they don't really get along. Basically, Mercosur is paralyzed. I don't see any future for Mercosur as like a political mediator of any kind, or even as an economic integration scheme either. So I think when we have a dysfunctional government in Brazil, really all this machinery that Jennifer was describing started to get problems because of the massive size of Brazil and the importance of Brazil in South American politics. So yeah, I think it doesn't look very optimistic, the process right now.
And putting that into the context of your work, Stefano, in the introduction to the volume, you talk about some regional organizations actually working against democratization or obstructing them, right? Especially when you have this polarization that you see in society or amongst countries, amongst the actors.
Yes, I mean, the literature on international organizations and democratization, I think for a long time had a sort of liberal bias. Putting it in a caricature was something like, so democracy is the best political system possible, and international organizations are there to defend it and to protect it. And we know now, because there is a bulk of literature about this, that actually regional organizations can also be autocratic and can also promote some sort of autocracy. This is mostly the case of regions that are not the Americas. Let's think of Central Asia. Let's think of the post-Soviet space with organizations like the CIS or even the ASEAN in Southeast Asia, in which you have these organizations that are basically made up of authoritarian governments. So then you have different phenomena. You have organizations that have adopted the language of democracy and democracy protection and human rights commitment, but actually they just do it in order to kind of boost their own legitimacy and the legitimacy of their member states. And then you have organizations that actually go farther, and they basically adopt norms and instruments, but for the opposite purpose, undermining or offering forum shopping opportunities. So there, the case of electoral observation missions is a case in point. You have many organizations that have developed this sort of electoral observation missions, and they basically are just offering forum shopping possibilities for non-democratic or electoral autocracies. In the case of the Americas, we had a bit of that. I think Jennifer mentioned it in the case of UNASUR. I mean, I normally defend UNASUR. I was fond of the idea of UNASUR, and actually I think in several areas UNASUR played an important role. But in what is about electoral monitoring, I think UNASUR was pretty much following this model of offering alternatives to Maduro and to other autocratic governments in the region, and competing with other types of electoral observation missions. So I think that would be the example that I would put for the case of the Americas.
I guess it's also relevant with when you have Trump or Bolsonaro being less interested in democracy building overall. Is that a simple extension of what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure whether Bolsonaro and Trump have really adopted these strategies with the organizations, but you definitely, when you have authoritarian member states, and when you have the main member states of an organization that are not really having democratic credentials, of course, this has an impact on how the organization works and how they can actually be accountable to their democratic commitments.
How it works or how it doesn't work, perhaps.
Exactly.
I'd like to circle back to the topic of Cuba a little bit. There's been a bunch of speculation about what the Biden administration might or might not do. On some hand, from one perspective, they say, oh, he'll return to the more openness of the Obama period. And the other said, no, he's going to be now even more worried about Florida. And so there's not going to be any change. So I'm curious about what the two of you think about Cuba.
I think he'll be more open. Though I don't have any inside information to back that up. I just think that, the people who are advising him and in his own record, that he'll be more open, maybe not returning exactly to where it was with Obama, but certainly not trying to punish Cuba so much, and trying to bring them in to dialogue. The other thing I wanted to say is that we hadn't mentioned, but I think that what Biden will do, his main interest has been for a long time the Northern Triangle in Central America. And I think that's actually where he's going to put his focus. And because it has, affects immigration to the United States as a huge crisis. So I do think that's where he's going to put his focus in terms of both seeking more aid, but hopefully it will also involve human rights, reduction of crime and physical insecurity, and some democracy promotion there. That maybe we'll see some probably very slow incremental change, but perhaps that is where I expect that he will put his attention.
Yeah, I also expect that there will be a sort of normalization of relationships towards Cuba, as towards Latin America in general. But as I said before, I think it will depend finally on how it's going to be organized, this foreign policy executive, and also, as I said, the role of these other actors that are sort of outsiders of the main foreign policy executive, but that wield a lot of influence. So I don't expect a radical change. I expect a normalization process that probably is going to be much more gradual than many of us would wish.
So if it moves back in the direction of what the Obama administration opened, will that have an important impact on on mediation with Venezuela or Nicaragua?
Oh, I think so. I think it's a requirement in order to move toward a Venezuelan solution. Kind of a prerequisite. Certainly, continuing a Trump approach to Cuba is not going to, help Cuba help solve the Venezuelan situation. And I want to say too, just before we end, because I was so kind of pessimistic in my view, but I do think if we're looking at the whole global situation, that we now have a multipolar world. We've had a world with the U.S. withdrawing from so many cooperative agreements, and that Biden, of course, will try to bring us back to the status quo ante of much more multilateralism. But I think that that given the change that we've had, given the so many challenges to democracy around the world, not just in the region, that it does provide the opportunity for creativity and new solutions and new forms of cooperative arrangements to emerge. And that's where my optimism comes from, that I think it does open the door, that that what we've had has been so broken, partly trampled on by some actors and just broken, that it does give us the opportunity for people to be creative. I don't think it's going to happen right away because there are so many urgent things that so many countries are working on, but it does give me a little bit of optimism thinking about those opportunities.
In your paper, you talked about creativity in a different way of the organizations cutting out the United States. And so now you're saying creativity in the other way of maybe getting the United States back in the game?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, globally as well as regionally. So because it is much more of a multipolar world, because we don't have the US on top anymore, clearly. I mean, China's there, and the US has shown its lack of exceptionalism. And I think that's very clear to everyone, and our own vulnerability to democratic erosion. So I think I hope that will make the US a little bit more humble and maybe a better partner with other countries within the region and without, and maybe will allow us to participate on a more more equal level, with respect, with dignity for all. And the Biden administration is the one to do that, if anybody's going to.
We can only hope. I was going to, as you said, we're getting to the end of our hour, and I did want to give either or both of you a moment to talk about the U.S. election, perhaps thinking about democracy building and backsliding, and from your perspectives. It's a little outside the realm of what your papers are about specifically, but your expertise and interest I think might be interesting to our audience.
Right. Well, I cannot talk from the perspective of the US, but I can speculate a bit from the perspective of Latin America. And I think in order to all these norms and commitments to kind of work, it's necessary to have a US that is some sort of committed with multilateralism. And this is what we kind of, what disappeared in the case of the Trump administration, but also in the relationship between the OES and the Trump administration. I like to think that the main purpose of the OES, more than contributing to development, for this we have other institutions, or contributing to democracy, I think the main task and the main function of the OES is to keep the United States committed to multilateralism. And I think this went somehow lost because of the special administration that the US had in the last 4 years, but also in the way in which the OES and the General Secretariat kind of understood the role of the US in promoting democracy in Latin America. So I think I expect, or I wish maybe, not only a normalization of the relationship between the US and single Latin American countries, but also normalization of the role of the OES, embedding Latin American countries, Caribbean countries, and also US and Canada, of course.
Well, I'll just finish by saying this is what I'm working on now, is what I call pernicious polarization and how it harms democracy. I'm extremely concerned about the US and other countries around the world. But, this election is not, getting rid of Trump is not going to get rid of polarization. It's not going to get rid of the incentives for democratic erosion, and particularly for the Republican Party, because of the structural nature of our institutions, giving a disproportionate advantage to the Republican Party through the Electoral College, through the Senate, so that they don't have to expand their appeal attractiveness to a larger coalition or base. And that provides kind of perverse incentives. But really all we're changing is the top, Biden for Trump, and of course the executive branch. But Congress is basically the same. State legislatures are basically the same. Polarization, affective polarization is extremely strong within the society. And the Republican Party has not shown its willingness yet to stand up for election integrity and the rule of law. And so all of these things concern me, and it's going to be a long, slow struggle. But again, we've got to be creative. And I think what encourages me is at the grassroots level and the energy among the citizenry that we saw over the summer with the Black Lives Movement, the broad coalition supporting racial justice. And I think that we're seeing with our broken political institutions, I hope some interest across the parties, but particularly among the citizens, to push for other kinds of reforms besides racial justice and criminal justice and stuff, but also things like ranked choice voting. I'm a big fan of trying that more, and other kinds of reforms that will give us, that will address our crisis of representation that Stefano mentioned, that we've got to address in this country, and to rebuild our democratic resilience.
Thank you. I'm glad you found some areas for hope in this particular difficult time, both here and further south. I want to thank you one more time to our speakers, to Stefano Palestini and to Jennifer McCoy. It's a difficult time for everybody to be here, so I really appreciate their time and their insights. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll hope to see you in a couple of weeks to talk more about Venezuela. Take care. Bye-bye.